Imagine a flute that could kill a man before he even heard its melody, yet was carried by emperors as a symbol of divine power. Sounds like fantasy, right? But here's what most people don't realize. Throughout history, the line between music and murder was often disturbingly thin. Instruments weren't just tools for entertainment. They were engineered for deception, designed to hide death in plain sight. But the world of ancient warfare holds far more than swords and shields. Hidden in plain sight, musicians walked onto battlefields carrying what appeared to be harmless instruments, objects that could produce haunting melodies one moment and devastating violence the next. These weren't crude improvisations. These were masterfully crafted pieces, some weighing over 30 pounds, with blades sharper than modern surgical steel hidden within their frames. Warriors who mastered these instruments could slice through armor while their enemies were still trying to understand what they were seeing. Today, we'll uncover 6 of the most lethal musical instruments ever created, each one more ingenious than the last. And the first one? It was so effective at assassination that 3 different dynasties banned it by name. Instrument 1. The Chinese sword flute. Let's start in 15th century China, during the Ming dynasty. Picture this. A wandering musician approaches a military checkpoint, a simple bamboo flute hanging from his belt. The guards barely glance at him. That was their fatal mistake, because what looked like an innocent flute was actually a fully functional sword, and the musician, a trained assassin. The Chinese sword flute, known as the Jian-di, was a marvel of engineering that would make modern weapon designers jealous. Here's how it worked. The body of the flute was constructed from reinforced bamboo or metal, appearing completely hollow with 6 to 8 finger holes that actually functioned for playing music. But hidden inside was a thin, razor-sharp blade that could be drawn in less than a second. The mouthpiece would detach, and suddenly, the musician had a 2-foot sword in his hands. But here's where it gets even more brilliant. These weren't just disguised weapons. They were fully operational instruments. Assassins would spend years learning to play them beautifully, performing at tea houses and noble courts, building trust and reputation. They became so skilled that some actually made their living as musicians while waiting for years to receive their true mission. The blade itself was forged using techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 2 centuries. Smiths would fold the steel up to 30 times, creating a cutting edge so fine it could split a hair lengthwise. But the weight distribution had to be perfect. Any imbalance would affect the musical tone and raise suspicion. Now, you might be thinking, how many people actually died from these things? The historical records are chilling. In 1449, during a diplomatic meeting between Ming officials and Mongol delegates, 3 Mongol generals were killed in under 10 seconds by what appeared to be court musicians. The emperor was so disturbed by the incident that he ordered every flute in the capital city to be inspected. They found over 200 weapon flutes in circulation. But the most fascinating part? The technique wasn't just about surprise. Masters of the Jian-di developed an entire fighting style that incorporated musical performance into combat. They would play specific melodies that contained coded instructions for accomplices, or use the rhythm to mask the sound of the blade being drawn. One legendary assassin, known only as the Piper of Shadows, reportedly killed 17 targets over a 12-year career, and every single one of them died while he was playing a funeral dirge. The Ming dynasty eventually banned the sword flute in 1502, making possession punishable by death. The Qing dynasty upheld the ban. Even the Republic of China kept it on the books until 1928. 3 dynasties, spanning over 4 centuries, all terrified of a musical instrument. But that assassination technique? It was nothing compared to what Buddhist monks were hiding in their temples. Instrument 2. The Korean Kwarengwari shield. In 16th century Korea, during the Imjin War against Japanese invaders, something strange started appearing on the battlefield. Japanese samurai reported encountering Korean soldiers who would bang small gongs while advancing, and then those same musicians would suddenly have shields that seemed to appear from nowhere, deflecting arrows and blade strikes with ease. These weren't 2 separate objects. They were the Kwarengwari shield, a small bronze gong that doubled as a combat shield, and it changed Korean military tactics forever. Here's what made this weapon so devastating. The Kwarengwari is a small hand gong, about 20 centimeters in diameter, traditionally used in Korean folk music and shamanic rituals. But Korean military engineers realized something brilliant. If you cast it from thick enough bronze, reinforce the back with a leather grip, and angle the surface correctly, it becomes an incredibly effective defensive weapon while maintaining its acoustic properties. But the genius wasn't just in the construction. It was in the psychological warfare. Imagine you're a Japanese samurai in 1592, charging across a field toward Korean defenders. You hear the rhythmic clanging of these gongs. Crash, 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 getting louder and louder. It sounds like a religious ceremony, maybe even a funeral rite. Then suddenly, the musicians are in combat formation. Those same gongs raised as shields, and arrows are deflecting off them with a distinctive metallic ring that echoes across the battlefield. That sound? It was terrifying. Japanese accounts describe the demon gong warriors whose shields would sing with the voices of angry spirits when struck. Some samurai genuinely believed the shields were blessed with protective magic. But here's the practical brilliance. The concave shape of the gong didn't just make musical sense, it was perfect for deflecting blows. The bronze was thick enough to stop arrows and even deflect katana strikes. The raised rim could catch blades and trap them momentarily, giving the wielder time to counterattack. And because it was smaller than a traditional shield, it was incredibly maneuvering friendly, perfect for the close-quarters combat that defined many battles of that era. Korean soldiers would train in a unique dual-purpose style. They'd practice musical performances to build rhythm and timing, which translated directly into combat awareness. The same muscles used to strike the gong with a mallet would be used to punch with the shield's reinforced edge. Masters could break bones with a well-placed shield bash that also produced a perfectly pitched note. Now here's something that'll blow your mind. Korean commanders used these instruments to send coded messages during battle. Different rhythms and pitches meant different commands. Advance, retreat, flank left, prepare for cavalry. The Japanese couldn't decipher the code because they weren't musicians. By the time they realized the performances were actually tactical communications, they'd already lost the strategic advantage. One battle in particular, the Battle of Haengju in 1593, saw a small Korean force of about 2,300 defenders hold off over 30,000 Japanese troops for 10 days. Historical records note that the defenders used musical instruments as shields and weapons, with the distinctive sound of the kwarengwari echoing constantly from the fortress walls. Japanese commanders reportedly found the sound so psychologically disturbing that some troops refused to advance. But the really dark part? After the war, when Japanese forces finally captured some of these shield gongs, they tried to replicate them. They failed completely. Korean bronzesmiths used a specific alloy ratio and casting technique that the Japanese couldn't reverse engineer. To this day, authentic historical kwarengwari have a unique resonance that modern reproductions can't match. The tradition survived for centuries, though its weapon applications faded. Modern Korean folk performers still use the kwarengwari, completely unaware they're carrying what was once a weapon that helped save their nation. But if you think a shield gong is creative, wait until you hear about what African warriors were doing with drums that could rupture internal organs. Instrument 3. The West African Talking Drum Club. Deep in the forests of 13th century West Africa, the Yoruba Empire had a problem. Their enemies had learned to recognize military drum signals, making surprise attacks nearly impossible. So Yoruba weapon masters developed something revolutionary, a talking drum that was also a war club capable of crushing skulls, and the enemy would never see it coming until it was too late. The Dundan talking drum is one of the most sophisticated instruments ever created. Shaped like an hourglass, with leather stretched across both ends and connected by leather tension cords, it can mimic the tonal language of Yoruba by squeezing the cords while striking the drum head. In skilled hands, it literally talks, conveying complex messages across miles of jungle. But here's what the history books conveniently leave out. The military versions were engineered for combat. The wooden body was carved from ironwood, one of the densest woods on Earth, harder than many metals. The hourglass shape wasn't just for acoustics, it created the perfect weight distribution for a swinging weapon. The narrow middle section served as a grip, while both the top and bottom bulbs were heavy enough to deliver devastating blows. We're talking about an instrument that weighed 8 to 12 pounds, carved from wood that could dent bronze armor. Yoruba drummers would carry these into battle, playing communication patterns while advancing. The enemy would see musicians, support personnel, not threats. Then the formation would shift, and suddenly those drummers were in close-quarters combat, swinging their instruments like meteor hammers. The curved surface of the drum head could crush bone, while the ironwood body could punch through leather armor. But the psychological element was even more brutal. In Yoruba culture, certain drum rhythms were believed to carry spiritual power. Warriors who were killed by the sacred war drums were said to have their souls trapped inside the instrument, forced to serve their killer. True or not, the belief was widespread. Imagine the terror of facing an enemy who believes that if you kill them with your drum, you'll enslave their spirit for eternity. Here's where it gets really dark. There are accounts of master drummers who would play specific death rhythms while in combat. These weren't just intimidation tactics. Some patterns were so deeply ingrained in Yoruba consciousness that hearing them would trigger a genuine fear response. Increased heart rate, shallow breathing, sometimes even paralysis. Modern psychologists call this culturally conditioned fear response. The Yoruba called it the drum that stops the heart. One legendary drummer warrior, known as a Yangalu, was said to have killed over 40 enemies with his drum during the Nupe Yoruba Wars of the 15th century. According to oral histories, he would challenge enemy champions to single combat, playing a complex talking pattern that roughly translated to "your ancestors are watching your death." Then he'd fight using only his drum as a weapon. He never lost. But here's something that'll make you rethink everything you know about drums. The leather tension cords? Those could be rapidly loosened and used as garrots or whips. The metal rings used to reinforce the drum heads could be removed and thrown as projectiles. The entire instrument was a modular weapon system disguised as a musical tool. British colonial accounts from the 1800s describe encountering Yoruba warriors who carried curious hourglass-shaped clubs that could somehow produce sounds. The colonizers didn't understand they were seeing instruments until captured warriors demonstrated their musical function. Even then, most British officers dismissed the combat applications as native superstition. They learned otherwise during several brutal uprisings where these drum clubs proved devastatingly effective in jungle warfare. The British eventually banned their possession in certain territories, classifying them as instruments of rebellion, one of the few times in history a musical instrument was explicitly outlawed by a colonial power. The tradition evolved but survived. Modern Yoruba talking drums are lighter, more refined for pure musical performance. But in some villages, old families still keep the heavy ironwood versions, the war drums, locked away. They're brought out only for specific ceremonies, and if you know what to look for, you can see the dents and dark stains in the wood that tell a different story than the music they play. Speaking of hidden violence, there's one instrument that makes all of these look tame, because it didn't just hide a weapon. It was designed specifically to kill from the moment it was conceived. Instrument 4, the Indian Salpinx claws. In 17th century India, during the rise of the Maratha Empire, a new class of warriors emerged who would change assassination forever. They were called the Nakvas, the claw-bearers, and their weapon of choice looked exactly like the finger picks used by sitar players. Except these picks had 6-inch curved blades attached, and they were specifically designed to shred human flesh while producing beautiful music. The Salpinx claws, named after a demon in Hindu mythology with blade-like fingernails, were worn on the thumb, index, and middle finger of each hand. To any observer, a performer wearing them looked like a dedicated musician, using finger picks to pluck strings. But those picks were sharpened to a razor's edge, curved to maximize cutting surface, and positioned for maximum arterial damage. Here's what makes these particularly nightmarish. They were designed for intimate assassination. Maratha warriors would train as musicians for years, becoming genuinely skilled at playing the sitar, veena, or tanpura. They'd perform at royal courts, noble weddings, religious festivals, building trust, becoming fixtures in the social landscape, all while wearing their weapon on their fingers. Then, when the moment came, a simple gesture during a performance, reaching forward to adjust the instrument, accepting a cup of wine, even just an expressive hand movement, could open someone's throat in a fraction of a second. The wounds were distinctive and brutal. The curved blades were designed to slice through soft tissue easily while getting caught on bone and cartilage, creating maximum damage as they were pulled back. A single swipe across the neck could open 4 or 5 separate wounds, making it nearly impossible for even skilled physicians to stop the bleeding. Victims would be dead in under a minute, while the assassin would still be performing, the blood on their hands dismissed as part of the theatrical performance. But here's the genius part. The musical technique actually made users more deadly. Sitar players develop incredible finger strength, speed, and independence. Each finger learns to move with precision while maintaining complex rhythmic patterns. Those same skills, lightning-fast finger movements, perfect timing, the ability to strike multiple strings in rapid succession, translated directly into combat. A master Nakhvar could deliver 10 cutting strikes in under 2 seconds, targeting throat, wrists, face, and major arteries with surgical precision. Training was conducted in secret, passed down through specific families who served as the Maratha Empire's shadow force. Students would spend years playing increasingly intricate musical pieces while wearing blunted practice claws, building the muscle memory until violence and melody became inseparable. The final test was reportedly horrific. Play a perfect raga while executing a condemned prisoner. If the music faltered, the student failed. Historical records are deliberately vague. Assassination techniques aren't usually documented in official histories, but there are clues. Numerous accounts from the period mention musicians at court functions where nobles mysteriously died from sudden bleeding injuries. One British East India Company report from 1672 describes a dinner party where a visiting Maratha musician inexplicably attacked guests with his finger ornaments, killing 3 before being subdued. The official dismissed it as madness, but Indian historians believe it was a calculated political assassination. The psychological impact was profound. Paranoid nobles would ban musicians from carrying anything that looked like finger picks. Some courts required performers to play with bare hands, severely limiting what could be performed. Certain ragas became associated with assassination and were forbidden at royal events. The mere sight of a musician wearing elaborate finger ornaments could clear a room. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. Now, here's something that'll keep you up at night. The Salpinx claws never really disappeared. Modified versions were used during India's independence movement in the 1940s. British intelligence reports documented musicians involved in the assassination of colonial officials, with wounds consistent with specialized cutting implements worn on fingers. Even today, certain martial arts schools in Maharashtra teach Nakhvar techniques, though they officially claim it's only for historical preservation. The instruments themselves are incredibly rare. Most were destroyed or hidden after the British banned them in 1858. Museums have maybe a dozen authenticated pairs worldwide, and they're kept in secure storage, not on display. Because even now, over a century later, they're still considered too dangerous to show the public. But if weaponized finger picks sound disturbing, they're nothing compared to what Mongolian warriors did with instruments that could be heard for miles, and used to coordinate mass slaughter. Instrument 5. The Mongolian Morin Khur mace. The year is 1220. Genghis Khan's army is sweeping across Central Asia, and terrified defenders report something that makes no sense. Mongolian cavalry units riding into battle led by horsemen playing horsehead fiddles. But these aren't fragile wooden instruments. They're reinforced weapons that can crush armor, break swords, and signal tactical commands across 10 miles of open steppe, all while producing haunting melodies that freeze enemies in place. The Morin Khur, or horsehead fiddle, is the national instrument of Mongolia. It's a 2-stringed bowed instrument with a distinctive carved horse head at the top of the neck, and its sound is said to capture the spirit of the Mongolian grasslands. Beautiful, right? Now imagine that same instrument, but the wooden body is reinforced with metal plates. The decorative horse head is cast from bronze with sharpened edges. The bow is weighted at the tip for striking, and the entire thing weighs 15 pounds. That's the Morin Khur mace, and it was one of the most effective cavalry weapons ever designed. Here's why it was brilliant. Mongolian warfare depended entirely on coordination. Cavalry units needed to wheel, charge, retreat, and regroup in perfect synchronization across vast distances. Flags and shouts didn't work in the chaos of battle. But music? Music could be heard for miles, and different melodies could convey complex tactical information. Mongolian commanders developed an entire musical language. Specific melodies meant advance, feint left, prepare arrows, full charge. The tempo communicated urgency. Pitch changes signaled which unit should respond. A single musician could coordinate hundreds of warriors across a battlefield so large that visual signals were useless. But the weaponization was what made it legendary. The instrument's body was constructed from hardwood reinforced with iron bands. The horse head at the top wasn't just decorative. It was a weighted striking surface that could be swung like a morning star. The bow was reinforced with a metal core and weighted at the tip, making it function as a short staff or baton. In close combat, a mounted musician could play with one hand while using the bow as a weapon with the other, maintaining coordination signals while actively fighting. And the psychological warfare was extraordinary. Mongolian armies would position their musical units at the front of charges. Imagine being a defending soldier, watching the horizon fill with thousands of Mongolian cavalry, and hearing this haunting, otherworldly music growing louder and louder. The sound of the Morin Khur has a specific quality. It resonates at frequencies that some describe as mournful, others as threatening. Defenders reported hearing what sounded like thousands of ghostly horses galloping toward them before the actual army even came into view. European crusaders called them the devil's fiddles. Persian accounts describe instruments possessed by demons that sang of death. The terror was so effective that some cities reportedly surrendered when they heard the music approaching, without ever seeing the actual army. But here's the practical combat application. Mounted musicians were priority targets. If you could kill the musician, you could disrupt enemy coordination. So these instruments had to function as weapons. Historical accounts describe musicians who continued playing even while surrounded by enemy soldiers, using their instruments to defend themselves while maintaining the signal for their units. One legendary figure, a musician warrior named Sukbeta, possibly a title rather than an individual name, was said to have held off a dozen Chinese soldiers at a river crossing while playing a retreat signal, allowing his unit to escape. He reportedly killed 4 attackers with his instrument before finally being overwhelmed. The melody he played, now called the Last Song of Sukbeta, is still performed at Mongolian military commemorations, though modern musicians have no idea they're playing what was essentially a combat command. The technique required extraordinary skill. Musicians had to maintain perfect pitch and rhythm while riding at full gallop, while potentially in combat, while coordinating multiple units. Training took years. Young musicians would practice playing while performing military drills on horseback, building the ability to fight, ride, and perform simultaneously. Here's something that'll make you rethink military history. The Mongolian Empire conquered more territory than any continuous land empire in history. They coordinated armies across thousands of miles with unprecedented precision. And a significant part of that coordination was achieved through weaponized musical instruments. After the empire fractured, the combat techniques were mostly lost. The Morin Khur survived as a purely musical instrument, though the modern versions are much lighter and more delicate. But in rural Mongolia, some families still keep the old instruments, the heavy ones, with the reinforced necks and bronze horse heads. They don't play them anymore. They mount them on walls as reminders of when their ancestors conquered half the known world with music and violence in equal measure. But even the Mongolian war fiddles pale in comparison to what ancient Greeks created. An instrument so powerful it was said to literally shatter stone and kill with sound alone. Instrument 6, the Greek Salpinx spear. We've saved the most devastating for last. Ancient Greece, around 400 BCE. The Spartans are marching to war, and at the front of their phalanx are men carrying what appear to be bronze trumpets, 7 feet long, gleaming in the sun. The enemy thinks they're just musicians, ceremonial players there to boost morale. They're dead wrong, because those trumpets have spearheads, and the men carrying them are about to do something that seems impossible. They're going to blast a deafening war cry directly into enemy faces while simultaneously impaling them. The Salpinx was the ancient Greek war trumpet, used to signal commands and intimidate enemies. But the Salpinx spear took it further. It was an actual spear with a functional trumpet built into the shaft, creating a weapon that could kill in 2 ways at once: physical impalement and acoustic shock. Here's how it worked. The weapon was constructed from bronze tubing, 7 to 8 feet long, with a spearhead at one end and a bell at the other. The shaft was hollow, allowing it to function as a resonating chamber. A mouthpiece was positioned about 18 inches from the spearhead end, offset slightly from the central axis so you could blow while thrusting. The entire weapon weighed about 12 pounds, heavy enough to be devastating in a thrust, light enough to be maneuverable. But the acoustic component was what made it truly terrifying. Ancient Greek armies understood something that modern militaries have only recently rediscovered. Extreme sound can be a weapon. The Salpinx, when blown by a trained player, could produce sound levels exceeding 120 decibels, louder than a chainsaw, right at the threshold of physical pain. Now imagine dozens of these being blown directly at you from 6 feet away, in the middle of a chaotic battlefield where you're already stressed and terrified. The physical effects were documented by ancient writers. Aristotle mentioned instruments that could cause dizziness and weakness in opponents. Plutarch described soldiers who fell without wounds, struck down by terrible sounds. Modern acoustic weapons research confirms that sustained exposure to sounds above 110 decibels can cause disorientation, nausea, temporary blindness, and even internal hemorrhaging. But here's where it gets really dark. Spartan warriors who carried these weapons trained to blow and thrust simultaneously. Picture the technique. You're in a tight phalanx formation, shields locked, advancing. Your Salpinx spear is positioned over the top of your shield. You time your breathing with your steps. Inhale, step, exhale, blow, thrust. The enemy soldier in front of you gets a splitting blast of sound directly in his face at the exact moment a bronze spearhead is punching through his shield or armor. The psychological collapse was reportedly instantaneous. Warriors who'd held their lines against conventional spears would break and run when facing the Salpinx spears. The sound disrupted communication, made coordinated defense impossible, and created primal panic that overrode training and discipline. Athens used them at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Historical accounts describe the Persian army as being scattered by terrible sounds from bronze demons. Some modern historians have dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or mythology, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations at Marathon have uncovered fragments of bronze tubing with both spearhead mounts and mouthpiece openings, exactly what you'd expect from a Salpinx spear. The weapons were expensive to produce. A single Salpinx spear cost more than a full set of hoplite armor. Only elite units could afford them, which made them status symbols as well as weapons. Warriors who carried them were considered both musicians and elite soldiers, holding a unique position in Greek military hierarchy. But here's the most fascinating part. The technique required extraordinary breath control and physical stamina. You couldn't just blow the trumpet randomly. Effective use required timed, controlled blasts that coordinated with specific combat movements. Training combined musical education, spear combat, and intense cardiovascular conditioning. Masters could maintain acoustic assault for extended periods while fighting in full armor in brutal heat. One legendary warrior, Spartacus of Thebes, not the famous slave rebel, different person, common name, was said to have held a narrow pass against 40 Athenian soldiers using a Salpinx spear. According to Diodorus Siculus, he would blast terrible sounds that made men fall before his spear even touched them. Historians debate whether this is literal or metaphorical, but the account exists in multiple sources, suggesting some truth behind the legend. The Romans eventually adopted similar weapons, calling them asta sonatus, the sounding spear. Julius Caesar mentioned them in his Gallic Wars, noting that German tribes would flee before Roman formations that employed them. But the Roman versions were apparently less effective. The Greeks had perfected acoustic engineering in ways the Romans couldn't replicate. By the Byzantine era, the techniques were lost. Trumpet and spear had separated back into distinct tools. But some Byzantine military manuals include curious references to the ancient Greek method of combining wind and blade, suggesting the knowledge survived in fragmentary form for centuries after the weapons themselves disappeared. Modern experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate Salpinx spears based on ancient descriptions and archaeological fragments. The results are startling. Test subjects exposed to controlled blasts report immediate disorientation, difficulty focusing, and intense desire to retreat. And that's in controlled conditions, wearing ear protection, knowing it's a test. Imagine experiencing it in actual combat. Today, you can see replicas in museums, carefully deactivated, the trumpet elements filled with resin so they can't be played. Because even museum curators understand that some ancient weapons are too dangerous to fully reproduce. The Salpinx spear represents something we've only recently come to understand. That sound itself can be a weapon as deadly as any blade. And that's the terrifying truth about these 6 instruments. They weren't aberrations. They were innovations by cultures that understood something we often forget. That the line between art and warfare has always been thinner than we'd like to admit. That beauty and violence can emerge from the same source. That the same hands that create music can also create death. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden histories, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the weapons and warfare that shaped our world.